Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts for our artful evening talk and presentation by Dr. Renee Sentilles. So Dr. Renee Sentilles has come to us tonight from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and she specializes in American women's history, gender and sexuality, childhood and youth, and 19th and 20th century U.S. cultural history. Dr. Sentilles is currently working on a book project called In Her Shoes, Getting to the Soul of American Women's History, that uses shoes as an entry point into multicultural women's history. She is the author of Performing Menken, Ada Isaacs Menken and the Birth of American Celebrity, and American Tomboys, 1850 to 1915, as well as various articles and review essays. Dr. Sentilles is also an artist, and she has experience in glass jewelry creation, fiberworks, and painting. She completed her doctorate at the College of William & Mary. So tonight we are so honored to be joined by Dr. Renee Sentilles, as she is here to discuss Clara Driscoll and the women behind the Tiffany Studio. The Kalamazoo Institute of Arts permanent collection holds several original glass Tiffany works on display, several of which are on display downstairs in the exhibition Unveiling American Genius. So if you haven't had a chance to see those yet, we highly encourage you to come back another time and get to see some original Tiffany works on display. We are really excited to welcome Dr. Sentilles to the podium for her presentation, which will enable all of us to understand more about the history of the Tiffany Studio and the important role that women played in its early history. And as a final note, we will have time for questions at the end. So when Dr. Sentilles is ready, please just, if you have a question, raise your hand or get my attention in some way, and I will come around with a microphone so that everybody can hear each other. And then at the conclusion of tonight's event, I actually have some original Tiffany glass that is up here on display. So you are more than welcome to come up and look at this glass, to hold it and see it and see how it changes in the light. This glass was donated to us by John Lauren, who is the design director emeritus of the Tiffany Studios. And we are really excited to be able to share it with you. So without further ado, Dr. Renee Sentilles.
Is this on? Hello. No. Oh, yes, it is. Hi. I just want to make sure you can hear me. We're trying to figure out how the microphones are working. Hi, I'm Renee Sentilles. I'm going to try not to do that again. I hope you get a chance to look at the works downstairs. But for now, let's just we're going to be talking about Clara Driscoll and how she fit into Tiffany Studios and the women around her. So I first want to thank the Kalamazoo Institute of Art and Sandra Sundstrom for organizing this. I've never been to Kalamazoo. It's really fun. I wish I had more time. There's lots to look at, I discovered. And I also discovered that Cleveland's only a 4-hour drive away, so I can come back. So I'm going to talk today about Clara Driscoll. I'm going to time this because I want to make sure we have time to take questions. Okay, so Clara is now known as the woman who designed the Tiffany lamps. This has been getting attention, and I'll tell you why. Before I start to talk about, can you hear me? Is it coming and going? I can try, but I've seen weird things before. Let's see. Okay, we're playing with the microphone right now. Okay, this is probably the most famous of her works, the Wisteria lamp. This is a piece from 1901, so you probably recognize this. If you don't recognize this, that would be kind of miraculous because it's sold all over the place. You've probably seen reproductions. Some of these are from Amazon, Wayfair, I can't remember before, eBay. This is another one of her most famous works, and this one is notable because she actually did get an award for probably the one on the, it's actually not quite the same, but it's similar to the one on the left, the dragonfly and water lilies. So these are two of Clara's designs. And again, you can buy these knockoffs all over the internet now. Here's some more. And they range anywhere from about $200 to $12,000. Here's Apple Blossom. Poppy, another one of her most famous pieces. Butterfly Lamp, $18.99, and Spiderweb, $1900. And here you want to notice that the base is a mosaic. It's actually put together. She actually refers to the one on the left, which I'm going to read from one of her letters in a moment. The spiderweb, you can see the top is this intricate prevail glass, and then in the bottom, it's the mosaic. That mosaic idea is something that Clara came up with herself from having worked in mosaics for so long. Okay, so this is a picture of Clara Wolcott Driscoll. So for this talk today, it's going to be broken into 4 parts. First, the lamps. Then I'm going to talk about Clara and Mr. Tiffany. Then I'm going to talk about the Tiffany Girls. And then finally, the context of the new woman. I'm not sure how the sound is. Are you actually hearing this? I think I will, because this doesn't seem to be working.
It's working until you touched it the last time. Trying to stop normal now.
Okay. I don't think, see, it's going back and
Yeah,
forth.
we can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you turn your head away from the mic a lot and it stays in place, you'll lose your sound. That's why.
Okay, well,
Would you prefer a handheld?
no, I'll try this, and but I can't promise that I won't move my head. Okay. Okay, so Clarence is the oldest of 4 girls born in Talmadge, Ohio. Her father died when she was 12 years old, so she grew up in a family made up of the 4 girls, their aunt, their grandmother, and their mother. So it's this very female-centered world. Actually, there's a lot about their family story that reminds me of Little Women. It's a very tight family with 4 girls. And we only know about Clara's design because of the closeness of this family circle. Beginning in 1891 with their mother, the 7 women start to write communal letters that they exchange every week, which they call the round robin. After everyone had read the letters, they were bound together by week and saved. Now, one of the things that's interesting, and I'm bringing this up because a lot of people would say, wow, how did we know? There's this woman who designed the Tiffany lamps and she's extraordinary. She is extraordinary, but one of the things that's most extraordinary about Clara Wolcott Driscoll is that we have letters. We actually have evidence of her, and she talks about designing the lamps. And it's kind of hard in the age of emails and text messages to understand how big these letters were. The longest by Emily, who would later become a writer, and Emily was the 3rd sister. The longest by her was 83 pages. So these are long letters. In fact, there's a point in 1907 when Tiffany has taken Clara Wolcott Driscoll and Agnes Northrup, who is 2 big female artists. He takes them on a European trip, and he writes in his diary later that night, Mrs. Driscoll to her sister's letter is the longest thing I have ever seen. Had a curiosity to see what she could find to say so much about when nothing has happened. And if you read the letters, it kind of feels like that. They'll literally write 3 pages on how the radiators that have been introduced in the house are changing the layout of the rooms. I mean, it's really small stuff and a lot of stuff about neighbors, but that's wonderful for historians because you actually get a picture of the lives of these women. It's unusual. So fortunately for us, Emily really kept these letters because she saw the value in them. And in the 1990s, they're donated to the Kent State Library and the Queens Historical Society in New York. In 2005, the curator Nina Gray heard of the letters in Queens. A few days later, a historian named Martin Eidelberg heard of the letters in Kent. They heard of each other. They joined forces with another person, Margaret Hoffer, and they wrote this book, A New Light on Tiffany. So they are the ones who really brought Clara Driscoll to the attention of the larger public. And I can't recommend this book enough. It's really wonderful and incredible detail. And as a historian, I sometimes struggle when they're what I think of as picture books, because the history is really good in this. They do a really lovely job. I'm going to go back. Okay, so this is an example of the things that Clara would write in her letters to her family about her work at Tiffany's. So I'm scared I'm going to lose the sound, but I am working on the butterfly candle shade. It is to be made of little iridescent glass butterflies flying around the candle flame, or rather appearing to fly, by means of a network of gold wire made into lines of flight. I made the plaster model of it first. It is not quite complete, and in this picture I'm carving on it with a little steel plaster tool. And we'll go back. That's the lamp that she's talking about on the left. And then this is her in the picture where she's carving the plaster base. This is an interesting picture because she's pictured with Joseph Briggs, who she did have several men who she also, at this point, then this is taken in, what is that, 1906, I think I said. She is managing all of these women, but she also has male workers who she manages. And Joseph Briggs is in charge of the kiln. So he's the one who's doing the sort of heavy labor with the kiln. And there's some interesting stories in the letters about him. So let me tell you a little bit about Clara. Clara attended the Western Reserve School of Design for Women, which is now the Cleveland Institute of Art, where she graduated in 1884. 4 years later, she moved to Manhattan to the Metropolitan Museum Art School. 2/3 of the 400 students were women. More and more women were going into art education in this period. Her sister Josephine follows her, goes to the same art school, and in 1888, they were both hired by Louis Comfort Tiffany to work in his glass studio, the Tiffany Glass Company of Manhattan. Now I want to take a second to talk about Mr. Tiffany, because a couple of reasons. One, you probably might get him confused with his father, Charles Tiffany, who founded the jewelry company, Tiffany and Company. That was founded in 1837. Louis Comfort Tiffany is his son, and he's actually an incredible artist. He trains under George Inness. He's widely considered one of the foremost American designers of this time, and he's a major force in the Beaux-Arts, not just in terms of his work, but in terms of organizing other artists. So you can see this is a piece of his jewelry. To the right over there is one of his stained glass windows, and then one of his paintings down on the bottom right. So he's a credible artist in his own right. He also turned out to be a great manager, like Clara herself. So they're both manager artists. They're both good at both. So he tended to hire, when he got excited about glass, about age 24, he became obsessed with glass, and he began experimenting with all these effects. And he becomes the head of this empire, but he continues to paint and exhibit other artwork and to hire artists and organize people to work on his designs. So he's painting and doing his own work, and he's also managing other artists. And to tell you, glass is addictive. If any of you have ever worked with glass before, it's addictive because it's colored with metals, and so you don't always know exactly what color you're going to get. So red is colored with gold. Different things have more silver or copper, and as it's fired in the kiln, it can bring out other colors and it can bring a shine. And so he starts to really experiment with all these different ways you can bring out different things in the glass. He really likes to take risks. And the thing is, he's the son of Charles Tiffany, so he has the money to take risks, unlike most artists. He hires women trained in the arts, and he pays them the same hourly wage as men in the same level of work. There are a lot of women being hired as artists in different fields. In book publishing, we have women who are designing book covers, doing illustrations, botanical work. So there are more and more women actually working in these, and they tend to do so silently. Like Clara Driscoll, and frankly, all of the designers under Tiffany, male and female, their work is subsumed under his name. So the great design houses tended to do this, right? So most people, it's not that he was ignoring her because she was female. In fact, this is true of all of his artists. One of the most extreme examples of that is the Fabril glass. He's most famous for Fabril glass. And by the way, the KIA has some great representations of this downstairs, some vases. And it's essentially what I was talking about before, where you take the glass and you fire it in such a way that it brings out the metals in the glass. And that was actually the discovery of Arthur Nash, one of his employees, who discovers it by rolling molten glass with molten metals, creating this, and it becomes the sort of big deal of Tiffany, but it wasn't created by Tiffany. It was created in Tiffany Studios. Here's an image of a design. It's designed by Maxfield Parrish, but it's actually put together by the Tiffany Glass Company. So this is the kind of work that they do. I mean, this is an extremely beautiful one, but you can see all of the detail from a distance. Now, Clara was one of what were called the Tiffany Girls by the people in the company. Clara and her sister began working for Tiffany, as I said, in 1888, probably in the mosaics department. The belief was women had smaller hands, and so they had a more delicate touch, and they could really move these little tiny mosaic pieces around. And there was also a belief that's still consistent that women have a better sense of color. So that's interesting, because women actually do have lower instances of color blindness, but like 100 to 1. So there's some interesting stuff behind that. But there was a belief that the women should do the mosaics because they had this vision and the tiny fingers. So that's where most of the women worked. And as she was hired in 1888, by 1892, she had about, she's hired in 1888, she leaves. She gets married to a man who's 30 years older named Francis Driscoll. And when women marry, they have to leave reputable businesses. So Tiffany said, if you're married, you can't work here. But that was true of all reputable businesses. If a middle-class woman had a job in an office, if she got married, she needed to leave. A teacher, she needed to leave. So it's not so much that Tiffany had this strong need to have only married women. It was a prevailing idea that respectable women, if they're married, do not work for wages. So this was a way of keeping the company respectable as well. So she has to leave, and she leaves for 3 years, and she writes all about Mr. Driscoll, and her family writes about Mr. Driscoll, and they all love Mr. Driscoll. And unfortunately, he dies 3 years later, and he apparently doesn't leave her enough to live on, because she immediately goes back to Tiffany and asks for a job. And Tiffany says, okay, I will hire you as the head of the women's glass department. So in 1902, she assumes, 1892, she assumes the head of this, and by 1894, there are 35 women under her control, or under her management. She left again in 1806 for another, well, it wasn't a marriage, she had an ill-fated engagement, as they put it, to this sort of wildly charismatic musician and painter named Edwin Waldo. And while they were going on their pre-honeymoon trip upstate New York, he disappeared. And basically, they didn't know where he went. And 6 years later, he was found. But by then, she didn't care anything about him. So there was this dramatic thing where she left to marry Mr. Waldo, and that didn't work out. So she ends up coming back to the Tiffany Studios quite soon. And she becomes known for the lampshades, but she also becomes known for the prototypes of the metal bases. So she's not just doing the lampshades, she's also doing the metal bases and small luxury items like inkwells. What are some of the other ones? I'm blanking on all kinds of things, all little things that go in the desk, decorative items. It was difficult managing the department because every time a woman got engaged or married, she had to leave. So there was some flux with that. One of the interesting things about the Tiffany Girls, and here's a picture of them on the roof of the building. They're from all different nationalities. Some people, I know there's one woman from Cuba who doesn't speak English, but she's gifted at working with the glass. So she works for the Tiffany Glass Company. They had 2 young men who were deaf mutes who also worked in the women's department. So they were really valued for their abilities. Some of them were trained in art schools, many others were untrained. The women mapped out the designs, and it's really fascinating what they do. So when you talk about the stained glass windows, not the lamps, but just the windows, you think about these huge windows. So what they would do is there would be a design on a small piece of paper, and then a woman would, and these are huge. If you see pictures, it's like a woman here, and they're like really high. And she draws out what's called the cartoon of the window, and then that is laid over 2 giant sheets with carbon paper between them, traced. This is so elaborate. One is put under a table, then another thing is traced, then that becomes the pattern for the glass. So all these tiny, tiny little pieces of glass. And what the women are doing, what many of these employees are doing, is they're choosing the glass, and they're marking it, and they're cutting it, and they're foiling the edges. And I wanted to show you this because I want you to understand why it's so important, the choosing of the glass. So you can see in these flowers, so they're taking a whole sheet of glass and choosing the pieces that are going to work best as the petals. So there's one woman who's choosing, and there's another woman behind her who's marking it and marking the piece that it is going to fill. So it's very, very elaborate. They foil the edges. At this time, you can't just go and buy copper foil like you can now. I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but you just put this copper foil on. At this point, they had to take big rolls of copper and paint beeswax on it and then cut it into little strips. So it's also labor intensive. They assemble them, and then the men solder them. So there was a gender division of labor, especially further on when I'll talk about the problems between the men and women. But there's definitely a sense that men cast the metal and women cut the glass and choose the glass. So the other thing that Clara had to do is she had to coordinate her work of the department with the glass factory that Tiffany created in Corona, Queens. He was making so much glass, they couldn't keep making the sheet glass in Manhattan, so they put up a big factory in Corona, Queens, and they moved some of the women into a branch there to do some of the bases and the porcelain work. A bronze foundry was added in 1897, and essentially the Corona branch becomes the men's warehouse mostly, with a few women there producing a few of the porcelain items. In the Manhattan business, they're producing the lamps, the windows, and the mosaics. And so she's running back and forth between Manhattan and Queens, which is not that easy at this period. So one of the things that happens is the women's branch is incredibly financially successful. And this upsets the men in Tiffany. And in 1903, the all-male glassmakers and glaziers union threatens to go on strike if they don't stop the women from making the windows, because the windows are this big, showy pieces. And there are some women who are actually getting quite well known for their windows. And Tiffany eventually will concede to their demands to refuse to, he says, okay, we're going to keep the women, but they're going to be limited to 35. The number that are here, 27. The number that are here, 27, never get larger than that. They're only going to make lampshades and decorative pieces. That's actually not what happened. They did still continue to make a few windows because they're actually really, really good at them. And Tiffany was smart to do this. I mean, they were his money-making part of his business. So he didn't want to get rid of the women. But the other thing is they're not unionized. So they can't threaten to go on strike. So they're actually the most dependable part of his workforce. As I said, like Clara, some of the Tiffany girls were trained in professional art institutes and designed alongside of her. And this is what I want to really bring to your attention, because Clara Driscoll has gotten a lot of attention, but there were a lot of other female artists that are doing this. One of the most famous is Alice Goody, and Clara talks about her all the time. Alice designs a lot of lamps with her, but what Alice is really good at is watercolors. And so a lot of times Clara will describe the kind of lamp that she wants, and Alice will paint it out. And they paint, it's a pattern. And so they're actually going to put this against the lamp. They make kind of a plaster base, and they put this around to try to see what it will look like as a lamp before they start this elaborate process. Another is Louise Pommier. I don't have an example of her work, but she's a ceramicist and an enameler, and she also co-designs a lot of these lamps. The most celebrated of all of them was Agnes Northrop. And it's kind of interesting to me that Agnes is the one, that Clara is the one that we pay attention to now, because in the time, Agnes was absolutely as famous as Clara. Both Clara and Agnes earned prizes at the World Fair in Paris for their Tiffany work. And their names are put on their work in the fair, but when it's written up in the newspapers, it's written up just as Tiffany's work. But in the fair, their names are on them and they get these huge prizes. These are some of the works that Agnes Northrop did. The one on the right, far right, is probably the most famous. And then there are other women that I found. I found like this lamp by Mrs. Curtis Fischel. I couldn't find any record of Mrs. Curtis Fischel, but there are other women who are designing some of this. So I don't want you to think Clara is the only one. She is the manager of all of it, which she's incredibly good at, I have to say. She's not only a good artist, but if you read the letters, you realize all the crazy things she's also managing to do. And she's also very good at figuring out the cost of things. So she'll say, we worked out this lamp and it was $250. Oh, this is the dragonfly lamp. It was $250, and they thought, no way we can sell it. And then, we brought it to the head of it. I don't think it was Mr. Tiffany. I think it was the person under him. And he said, well, we're talking about it. Maybe it's worthwhile. So let's go ahead and do it. And that ends up being not only a prize-winning lamp, but a multi-produced lamp. And what she does is she tries to figure out how to make it less expensive. How can they make these pieces? So I want to put her in the context of her times. So this is when I talk about the new women. So this is the context. This is a period of immense social change. The age of the new woman, I've seen 1890 to 1920, 1880 to 1910. So we're just going to stick to 1880 to 1920. But you can see these are two graduating classes, and they are from different places. But you can see how much change there is in 40 years. Not just the photography itself, but also the way they pose, the way they dress. They have corsets on the left. It's very stiff. It's very serious. It's much lighter and more playful. And frankly, the women look much younger on the right. So we're talking about a time of incredible change. And Clara is really part of that new woman wave. The year that Clara graduated from what is now the Cleveland Institute of Art, her principal, Harriet Keeler, noted, "From the schoolroom they go forth, the boy filled with the thoughts of his unlimited freedom and power, the girl with her almost unlimited limitations." And Principal Keeler was describing a situation that had been true for young women since the expansion of education, which was in roughly the 1830s. That's when you start to see an expansion of secondary school. It's not until really the 1870s that you start to get the women's colleges and expansion into state universities. But as she's saying this, the very girls who she's looking at graduation are going forth and starting to change the world. When Clara and Josephine Walcott left to seek their fortunes in New York City, they're part of a wave of young unmarried women testing exactly the limits that Keeler described. So while we want to celebrate Driscoll as being singular in terms of being a designer for sure and a manager, I also want to emphasize that she's quite typical of her time, and what she was doing was very much in keeping with her time. For example, she decided to go and find her fortune in a major city as an unmarried woman. Well, she was one of many young women doing this at the same time. They are often called women adrift in a negative way, but roughly, I'm sorry, I lost my place here. The idea is that you can be a new woman without losing respectability, that you can work in the public and not lose respectability. So there's a massive migration of young single women into cities, and that takes off as Clara is graduating in the 1880s and enters the workforce, and it's driven by several factors. As I said, one is the expansion of women's education. Women's education, these are several graduating classes, expanded at every level after the Civil War: elementary, secondary, college, and professional schools, including law schools and medical schools. It is spotty. Like a medical school will open its doors graduate 4 people, then shut them. Then another one will open over here and shut it. So it's not like it's continuing, but we see it kind of starting up. At the turn of the century, there are more women earning graduate and professional degrees at the turn of the 20th century than there will be after World War II. So it's a major, it's celebrated by the middle class. There's a common understanding that educated daughters could and increasingly would seek employment after college before marriage. Of course, many of them don't marry, and that's the big worry. Oh, shoot. Okay. Okay, the other thing that they're doing is the selling of style. And I guess I lost my place because I didn't really talk about it here. But you can see the styles that they're selling in the magazine. So this is also the age of the magazine. When they're starting to come out, magazines are mostly sold to women. We had Ladies Home, Godey's Ladies Book before, but now you're getting things like Ladies Home Journal. And there are a lot of images of women in athletics. I'm going to talk more about bicycles, but here you have women working in an office. These jobs used to be held by men. Now they're held by women, predominantly after the Civil War. You see women playing tennis. And so this is not actually happening in everyone's home, but they're getting magazines that show them images of women doing this. So a lot of girls are growing up in homes where their mothers aren't doing any of this stuff, but there's a sense that the wider world, that's what's happening. Of course, there are also the political movements. Temperance movement is huge in this point. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is the largest single organization in the country. And of course, suffrage is gaining momentum. So you can see all of this. Okay, this is the 1890s New Woman, and you want to look and see this image here of the woman dressed as a man and the man is doing the wash. That's a very typical kind of, this is what's going to happen if women go into the public. This idea that if women become emancipated, men will then become the women. Women don't seem to really buy this. What they do buy are bicycles. In the 1890s, the bicycle becomes the craze across the country and in England as well. It's a craze everywhere. So what happens is they develop what's called the safety bicycle of 2 even wheels and a chain so that almost everyone can actually get it to move. And women, for the first time, are able to move independently without chaperones across long distances. Clara Driscoll will do this a lot. She gets a bicycle for $40 and she rides it everywhere. And she buys like her biking costume. Another interesting thing with the advent of the bicycles is it leads to sportswear because women, it's hard to bicycle in a skirt. So they start to have skirts that can be divided into pants, and this will lead to more of that division. So there's a real celebration of that. But there are also women in golf and other sports. And I want you to understand that although we tend to, mainstream images tend to show new women as white and elite or middle class, there were many women of color who were participating in this as well, especially after you get the beginnings of the Great Migration, which starts around World War I, where you have Southern rural African Americans moving into industrial cities for jobs. And you see here a group of young women hanging out in their new women's wear. And you can see by their clothes, it declares that they're new women. That outfit of a shirtwaist, which is just a white blouse, and a string tie and a dark skirt is considered like this huge emancipation for women. No corsets, no bustles, no crinolines or hoops. And so this is supposed to really suggest how women are being freed. So bicycles were huge. Another thing, sports like basketball. Basketball is developed in, I think it's 1901 in Worcester, Massachusetts, and it very quickly, 1891, and it quickly goes to women. Almost as soon as it's invented, the woman who runs the sports at Smith College picks it up, does a women's version of basketball, and within literally 6 months, it's being played across the country by women. And there's stories of society women playing basketball, in high school women playing it's like across, it's this craze. And so we tend to think of athletics as a 20th century thing, but it's really starting in the late 19th century, and it is celebrated. Get to the 1900s, there's the Gibson girl, who's the most famous image of the period, the Gibson girl on the beach. This is certainly the period of the arts and crafts movement, and you have a lot of sort of romantic girls, like the one with the wreath on her head. And then also the time of the automobiles. And just like bicycles were a way that women could get out and have independent life, also automobiles. And here I also want you to notice the woman on the bottom is Asian. She's actually a fairly famous woman, Tai Lung-Schulz, who's the first woman to cast a ballot in the US election. Chinese woman to cast a ballot in the US election. So it's not only a white middle class thing, it is across the country, different groups. So what are the things that are changing? Work has changed. So people like Clara Driscoll going into the city, trying to find jobs. These are, of course, immigrant women in sweatshop labor in the middle there. But you can also see, here's the Tiffany Girls on the roof. These women are doing outwork in their house. So these women might be married. But remember, married women can't work at places like Tiffany's, but married women can do what's called outwork, which means they bring labor into their home, sew shirts or whatever, and then sell them. So that's considered respectable. It's also something that certain immigrant groups will do to keep women out of the public spaces, like Italian women will often do piecework or work in family stores and never work as domestics in houses. So there are sort of cultural rules about this. And that far right is from a department store. And that's probably the most amazing new innovation, is this idea of you could go in one place and find everything. And department stores are designed for women, for sure. They're designed for female shoppers. And the more elite girls are behind the counter, and women of color tend to be working in the back stock, or immigrant girls tend to be working on stocking the shelves. But it is a place, it's like a women's place. And when you read the letters of Clara Driscoll, she's doing all of this stuff. She's going to the store. She's riding her bike. She's going with female and male friends and taking picnics where they grill meat outside and, do all kinds of fun things. And she's very liberated in the sense of movement. So there's women's work. This is the idea of women should have fun, which kind of comes out in the 1910 to 1920s. And there are more and more images of this. And these are just popular to show you what's going on. One of the biggest changes is this move towards the older pictures. The most sexual part of the body was the legs. You never saw them. Now you see the legs. So this is a huge shift in how women are presented and what's considered okay. All right. And I'm just going to end with talking again about what this says about Clara Driscoll. So we want to say that, yes, Clara Driscoll was amazing. She was she was managing people. She was in a city with her sister. Her sister, by the way, dies shortly afterwards, and but Clara remains in Manhattan, so and continues to work there and make that her home. She rides her bicycle everywhere. She moves to a boarding house close to Tiffany Studios so that she can walk to work. And in that boarding house are men and women, which is typical of boarding houses. They're unmarried. She becomes really good friends with Edwin Booth, and after 10 years of going to operas and going to concerts and all this biking and all this stuff, they get married. So she marries Edward Booth. She leaves Tiffany and she kind of disappears. And this happens to a lot of women artists because every time a woman marries, she gets a different last name. So Clara Walcott Driscoll is actually famous for the Tiffany lamps. But after this, she becomes, well, famous to us and famous among her peers. She just becomes Clara Booth, and she does go ahead and paint silk scarves, and she has apparently a wonderful marriage and is very happy, but she kind of disappears from view. So what we want to notice is that the urban population of unmarried women outnumbered those of unmarried men. From 1880 to 1930, the national female labor force increased by 307%, by which point half of all single women were earning wages. So women are earning wages in the early 20th century. It's more acute in cities. In Chicago, for example, the female labor force increases by over 1,000% between 1880 and 1930. So like most unmarried women, Clara lives with other single women She enjoys this life, unlike many of these women. She's known to us. And so I'm trying to sort of wind this up so that we can get to questions. At one point, she and some of the Tiffany girls pool their resources and rent a house in Mount Pleasant, New Jersey, or Point Pleasant, New Jersey, so that they can have a time on the beach. And one of my favorite stories is Clara Driscoll decides she can buy this swimsuit for $3.50 if every time Alice Scooby or her sister wears it, they give her $1 or something like that. So they're managing their ways to do this. But what I think is fascinating is we know about Clara Driscoll, but how many other women out there who we don't know about who are also living these lives? And by the time she marries, she's in her 40s. So not what you expect to hear about women in that period. I want to end here and turn to questions. Do you have any questions for me? Yes, go ahead.
When you said that she married Edwin Booth, is that the brother of
No,
Margaret Booth?
No.
Oh,
Sorry. She's a big fan of Edwin Booth. This is another. I think it's Edward Booth.
Oh,
Yeah. So yeah, Edwin Booth, as you may know, was the most famous actor of the 19th century, son of Julius Booth, also brother of John Wilkes Booth. So famous family, not that family.
I have a question. You talk about, sorry if that's creating some weird noises. You talk about how we have this huge cache of her letters. It's called the Round Robin. And it's kind of my understanding that in this time period, although maybe I'm a little late or, that these letters were usually burned.
Oh, no. That's individual. So some people will request that people burn their letters and others won't. So no, actually Emily kept them for future generations. That's a great question. Margaret Mitchell wants all of her manuscripts and letters burned. People just do that to sort of protect their privacy after they die. Oh, yeah, this is really driving me crazy. This mic. Is it? No, can we switch to that?
Yes.
Thanks. Is this working? Oh, it's so much better. I had a really hard time because I couldn't keep my glasses on and use the microphone at the same time. So I've been like this. So do you have any questions about the time period, about Clara, about the windows, or any of that? I know some of you read the book, Clara and Mr. Tiffany. Does this sound much like the book? Did you like the book? You did. Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. She liked the book. So I didn't get to read it. I just found out like Monday, so I got a copy and I kind of looked through it and I immediately went, oh my God, I can't read this. Because to me, the depiction of the people was off. I mean, Mr. Tiffany was not, at least I haven't found anything that he's like flamboyant, and he's actually quite considerate of the women and really careful about, like when he takes the artist to Europe, I mean, he's careful about respectability. That's not really, there's no romance between Mr. Tiffany and Clara, for sure. But I didn't read the whole book. I just started it. So, yeah.
I'm just going to say for our virtual audience at home, you can also put your questions and I will convey them.
Yes.
How about the value of the various Tiffany product lines? How does hers hold up to her mother's parents' girlfriend?
The
Wait,
Tiffany.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat that
Yes.
question? The online viewers won't be able to hear that.
Thank you for reminding me. So his question is, how's the value of the Tiffany products when held up? So they've just increased. I mean, so some of these lamps that we're selling at the time for $400, $600 are now hundreds of thousands of dollars, especially the originals. When you think that there's 1,000 pieces of glass in the original wisteria lamp, and by the way, they did like 400 of those, but each one is individually made and each piece of glass is individually chosen. So it's not the same as how they would make them now, which would be to cast the pieces, right? Cast the glass. They wouldn't cut them individually and choose the colors the way they did. So that's why when you get the knockoffs, the glass is quite even. But if you look at the originals, there's almost like a drawing within the glass. So yes, they're very valuable.
In the book, hello. In the book discussion last week, we talked about how, I'm really sorry about whatever that sound is. We talked about how the lamps were meant to be seen with gas light, not with actual electric lights. So
I don't know that that's
you
true.
don't know?
No, I don't think so, because New York has gaslight by 1860. And when is the incandescent bulb? It's 1890s, right? Is that right? Or is it 1870s? I don't remember.
I think there were a lot of versions of the incandescent bulb starting from like 1820, and then Edison's is like 1880, 1890.
Okay, yeah, so don't worry about the earlier ones. It's the later one that you have to, because he actually makes it sustainable. That's a good question. I think they're actually for electric bulbs. And the reason I would say this is if his bulb comes out in the 1880s and these very wealthy, fashionable people are buying lamps, they're not going to be buying them. First of all, you have to connect the gas. So how would you connect it through the lamp? But they're not going to buy this old-fashioned gas lamp. They're going to have the new thing. So, but life is changing. I mean, people are living by incandescent light later and later in places like New York.
Sort of a digression, but was she active in getting votes for women? I mean, the amendment, suffrage.
I don't think it's a digression at all. I want more questions like that. He asked, is Clara Driscoll active in getting the vote? I couldn't find anything about how she felt about suffrage. And it's really interesting because some of the new women there's an assumption that new women all support suffrage, and that is not the case. And there are famous women in the public world with major roles who don't support suffrage. And then there are many women who do support suffrage. So there's a lot of different feelings. And it's not so much because the women don't believe that it's important for women to have a voice. They believe that this is what they argue, that politics is innately dirty and messy and immoral. And they don't want women to get involved in this immoral enterprise of politics. Anyone else?
Do you know how she felt about temperance?
I do not know how she felt about temperance, but as much fun as she was having, I just don't see her as a temperance girl. I say that, but I mean, it was the biggest organization, and temperance was really important. I mean, the fact that they managed to pass the 18th Amendment without women having any vote, and it was mostly a women's it was headed by women, is kind of incredible. But a lot of that was an anti-immigrant impulse, because the idea was we need temperance because immigrants are not, the men are all getting drunk and not taking care of their families. So it was also a kind of xenophobic movement.
I suppose what got you interested in this?
Am I interested in what?
No, what got you interested?
Oh, well, actually, so I was asked what got me interested in this. And then I think it's kind of a strange answer. Cleveland Museum of Art had an incredible show of Tiffany works. And they asked a few of us to go and give talks. And because I'm the local women's historian, they're like, do you want to do one? So I got involved, and then I got really into it. And then I wrote a blog for the Cleveland Museum of Art. And some of the letters are at Kent State, which is only 45 minutes away. So, and all of the stuff I'd read about Clara was about the lamps, but made it sound like, she was singular. And I was like, well, she's not singular. There's all this stuff going on. So I kept thinking, what can I find out about more women artists? And so far, I'm pretty frustrated. I mean, so if you're interested in reading any of her stuff, I know Kent, at least, a family member who donated letters took time to write out this, and it's typed, family history, and actually took a lot of the letters, the most interesting letters, and wrote them out. And you can write to them and have them send you a digital copy, and you can actually read some of these letters. But it's hard for me to imagine how to get something new out of it so far. I mean, I basically, I think the only way that I'm interested in it now is to see if I can find more information on other women artists in New York, probably. I mean, they're all over, really. Have you ever been to the Harvard University Glass Collection? They have this incredible, it's called the Botanical Collection. It's all these botanicals made out of glass individually. And a lot of those are made by women, is my understanding. So there's a lot of different artists out there to find. The problem is the records. There aren't records.
What happened to the other two sisters who didn't go to New York?
Thank you. I love to talk about stuff like that. So, so what happened was Josephine went to New York with Clara and dies after 3 years. But Clara isn't writing letters in the round robin as much, or we don't have them from that period. So we don't really know how she reacted to that. We think she died of tuberculosis. The next sister was Emily, and Emily became a teacher. She wanted to be a writer, so she became a teacher to make money. And she writes a lot about teaching. And she usually teaches math, actually. And then the youngest sister dies she's born with a weak heart, and she dies. And that's probably the hardest stuff to read in the letters, because she's dying and the doctor is sick and he can't come and treat her until he gets well. And so they're telling them she'll be fine, waiting probably in a month, he'll be able to look at her. And then meanwhile, she dies. So it's really hard to read some of this stuff because you know it's coming and they don't know it's coming when you read letters. That's like diaries. I used to cry over the diaries in the archives because I would know someone was going to die. They're like, oh, I'm feeling weak. And I'm like, oh no, you're dying. But they don't know that yet. So yeah, so there's a lot of that kind of more personal stuff in the letters.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
And in a general sense, do we know how many lamps that Tiffany folks produced?
That's a great question. He asked, how many lamps did the Tiffany folks produce? Yes, I'm sure there's records on all of that. I don't know. I haven't seen the number of how many Clara Driscoll designed and built. And at one point she says like they have an order for 20 or something. And she's always calculating the cost of each item, because if she can get the cost down, she's very ambitious and she wants her salary to go up. At one point she's earning $35 a week. It's about the same as the men at the same level, not the highest level, but she's well paid for a woman, but she still has to do all this maneuvering financially. So, but I don't know, right? But I know that her salary was connected to how many lamps she could get out and how she was going to keep the cost, because she writes about that.
Was that true of all of the women, or was that just true of Clara, that her salary depended on the lamp production?
Well, I don't mean to say it was tied so closely. What I mean is she was ambitious and she wrote, I want my salary to go up. If I can do this, if I can tighten up everything, then I will get a raise, essentially. So she was the manager, so nobody else could make more money doing that. It's interesting how much she gets into people's personal lives as the manager too. They'll call her in to talk about stuff. And when she has to have a meeting and she knows people are really grumpy, she goes out and gets ice cream. She's a really good manager. Like, she knows how to work with everyone. So any of you have Tiffany type lamps in your house? Were you surprised to hear that a woman designed many of the lamps? I was.
I read that book by Sarah that's what we really nice novel.
Yeah, she's written a number of books, hasn't she? Vreeland, Susan Vreeland, you're the author of
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, that's the name.
the novelist. It's very hard to write historical fiction because you have to work with historical stuff, but also imagine parts. And as a historian, I have a hard time when they imagine characters in ways that I don't think they should be. But as novelists, they have to, or they don't have a story. So it's like, so.
It was interesting hearing you talk about it because she brings the cycling into the book.
Yes, I actually read a review
So
that said that.
I thought that was interesting when you talked about her riding a bike. because I
Well, she
know-
talks about it. She writes in her letters about it, and they go far. I mean, and she's bicycling with single men who are friends in the boarding house, not just Edward, but his brother. I can't remember his name. She called them Book Booth and Butterfly Booth. And so the younger brother was Butterfly Booth because he collected butterflies. And so I know she would, just go on these long bike rides but she had so much fun. I think what surprised me was that a woman in her 40s in Manhattan who was single, who was widowed, could have so much fun and be respectable. And, it's kind of amazing to me. Well, it makes me think, well, maybe that wasn't that unusual in New York or Cleveland or Cincinnati. I'm sure it would be unusual in small town America. Did you have a question?
I don't know, not the microphone. We'll see how it goes.
First of all, let me apologize for my mask. With you being from Ohio.
I actually love that you had it. I was like, ooh, a Michigan mask. Yeah. I thought I'd see more.
Secondly, I am more interested in the design aspects of the lamps and how it progressed over the years. And so just a couple of questions. One, all told, how long was she there in management?
It's a good question.
And then, well, I'll pause for a minute and then I'll come back with the other question.
She is there in management for 3 years, and then now maybe I can actually wear my glasses and see something.
She was kind of in and then she was out.
Yeah, she's there. She's only gone really 3 years and a couple months over that strange engagement, which I have a hard time not talking about because it's so bizarre and funny in a interesting way. I don't mean to laugh at Clara's life, but yeah, she let's see, where is it? Trying to find.
So essentially, she spent pretty much an entire lifetime career there.
I don't know that I would say that. I mean, because she marries Edward Booth, and then she's not going to be in a professional life. So it's a short professional life. It's only like 20 years, if even that.
Okay, and then my other question is, in your research, where have you found the best set of catalogs of the line over time?
I have not looked for that. So
Photographs like the one you had at her
the photographs,
studio, things like that.
that's pretty much in the book that I have the image of earlier. All of the best pictures I found. I mean, I found them on the internet, but they're all in this book. And it's an amazing book, this one. So I highly recommend that, actually. And these are people who are art historians and curators. So they're going to have probably more of what you want to know about the actual. I can tell you a lot about how they actually did. I'm fascinated by the technical details of how they do all this, but in terms of the lines and how it worked, I couldn't figure it out, to be honest. I tried to figure it out because they would spend several years making one lamp and then they would stop. And I was curious about, is it that the patterns are wearing out? Like what decides that they stop this lucrative line? Are they tired of it? Can they only do 6 designs at a time and they have to decide which ones? I mean, I don't know.
Thank you.
But imagine how fun it was to be Clara, because she would get an idea. Oh, I'm gonna carve. I'm gonna do bronze bases because I don't like the bases he's doing. And I'm going to put beads in the eyes of the dragonfly's eyes. So it's going to be a combination. And then she goes and she gets this made. I mean, she gets to talk to all these different people to get them to do these pieces, which is pretty incredible. Anyone else? Okay, I think we're out of questions. So thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it. And I hope you get a chance. Oh, there isn't much for lamps downstairs. There's a lamp that I don't think is designed by Driscoll, but there's some really good stuff for Louis Comfort Tiffany. There's a beautiful pin. You can really see his work downstairs. So, oh, and there's also these pieces up here.